John Adams, this Constitution was intended for a moral and religious people, and it's wholly inadequate for the governance of any other. Well, if we are frustrated and our Constitution is not working and there's chaos and the heathen rage, if you will, there's a quote from Psalm 2, is it the Constitution's fault, or have we stopped being a moral and religious people? I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves that question, and I think that's what John Adams was warning us about. As I thought about preparing the biblical Christian for engagement in the culture war, I thought I was making up a slide, and I thought I'm going to say that the most important thing about the culture war is to know the rules of engagement. And then I realized on the way here, that's not really true. There's something far more important about the culture war to recognize, and that is that there is one. That is that there is one. I got a buddy, Neil Davis is here somewhere. Where are you, Neil? Stand up for just 1 second. Okay, this is my friend Neil Davis from Spokane. We're not done. That was just telling me who you are. Stand up for a second, please. Okay, suppose, just for a moment, suppose, Neil and I actually are good friends, but suppose that Neil and I are mortal enemies, absolutely mortal enemies. That is to say, we can't mutually exist. He has to destroy me or I have to destroy him. Imagine that for a second. Now, imagine what an advantage it would be for him if I didn't know it, if I wasn't aware of the situation. Wouldn't that be a great advantage for him? Thank you, Neil. He's not my enemy, but my point is that if we don't recognize there's a culture war, we're in big trouble. That's the very, 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 very first thing to understand. A couple of years ago, I went and spoke at the rally for that clerk, Kim Davis, who was the clerk of Clark County, I believe it was, and she had refused to issue a license to a same-sex couple. Do you remember that a couple of years back? Well, I got a call from a friend of mine named Cal Zastrow. I don't know if many of you know Cal. He is actually from Michigan, but originally he's a cheesehead. And he, you know what that means. He's a pro-life warrior and a great warrior for justice. I call him my Christian boombox friend because he's enthusiastic about everything. When you call him, if he calls you, he starts off the telephone conversation by going, "Revival! Missions! Praise the Lord!" You know, he's turned up loud all the way. He only has loud. But he's a fierce proponent for life. Anyway, he gave me a call because he was organizing this rally for Kim Davis out there in Kentucky, and he said. And by the way, I live in Maryland, and while I've been up here, I've heard people use the term and say it, Maryland, which I kind of like. I think it has a purity to it. I'm enjoying hearing about Maryland. But anyway, I live in Maryland, and I got a call from Cal, and he said, "I need you to come to Kentucky tomorrow morning." It was a 14-hour drive, by the way. "I need you to be here tomorrow morning. I'm going to give you 10 minutes to speak." And he said, "And in those 10 minutes, I don't really want you to do something as much as I want you to undo something." You know, I think G.K. Chesterton was once quoted as saying, everybody wants is a great man to come along and do something, but that's not what we need. What we really need is a great man to come along and undo some things. And that will be the test of greatness, I think he said. So Cal said, "I want you to come to Kentucky, and I want you to undo some things. I want you to undo 170 years of indoctrination by government schools. I want you to undo 150 years of indoctrination of the legal profession by what they call law schools." And I went to one a long time ago, about 2 years ago. "And I want you to undo 75 years of indoctrination by TV and major media, not to mention the United States federal government." So I went there, and I was so worried about my 10 minutes, I think I actually got this done in 8.5 minutes. Yeah. And in that time, I tried to make these points, this argument that Kim Davis had broken no law, because there is no law, and there can be no law, and there never will be any law which requires her to issue a marriage license to same-sex couples. Contrary to the popular belief, the Supreme Court of the United States ruling in Obergefell versus Hodges is not a law. It's not law. I'm going to explain that to you for By the way, has anybody ever read Obergefell v. Hop? Did anybody read that opinion? Please raise your hand if you've ever read a Supreme Court opinion. I see one. Let me just make a comment. This is a sidebar. If you ever take the time to read a Supreme Court opinion, particularly something like Roe v. Wade or Obergefell v. Hodges, your status, the Supreme Court in your eyes will lose a lot of status. You will no longer have the respect that you have perhaps for the Supreme Court. Read something that they write. It'll lower your esteem for them, I think. Anyway, that's a sidebar. I tried to make the point that the local officials there in Clark County should ignore the lawless directive of the federal judge which incarcerated Kim Davis. And our point was, show us the law or free Kim Davis. Show me the law or free Kim Davis. Because there is no law. So that was our situation a couple of years ago. And then I got this call from this guy, Jake MacAulay. Have you met him? Jake, I think, was here last year with y'all, right? And Jake is actually, I didn't mean to correct the pastor. Jake is actually the director of Institute on the Constitution. I am a co-founder, but now I'm just a teacher, just a little teacher. Jake has come along and he's our director, and he's doing a wonderful, terrific job. And he called me and said, Michael, I want you to go to Idaho, and I'm going to get you 45 minutes, okay? And in those 45 minutes, and by the way, the pastor told me today, that's all you got, buddy. You got 45 minutes, and then it's over. Your mic gets cut off. And what I want you to do is to undo. Once you go to Idaho, and undo 170 years of indoctrination by government schools, 150 years of indoctrination by the legal profession, by law schools, and 75 years of indoctrination by TV and major media, and not to mention the United States federal government. So I said, no problem. Right? Because I did it in 8.5 minutes, I can do it now. And my point here that I've made before is to win the culture war, you got to know the rules of engagement. You got to know the law. You got to know what law is and what law isn't, because they use the law to break the law. And what do we do when public officials whose job it is to defend the law use the law to break the law? Right? So we need to know, first of all, what law is and what law isn't. So at IOTC, Institute on the Constitution, one of our policies is to always display what our objective is for a talk. So here's my objective for being with you today. I want to present the issue of what law is and what law isn't in a manner so straightforward and so clear that the audience, that's you, will be able to articulate and effectively communicate the truth to family and community and the culture. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. I'm going to try to make this so simple that you can walk out of here and be able to articulate this argument. And in that way, together, we can undo 170 years of indoctrination by government schools, 150 years of indoctrination of the legal profession by what they call law schools, and 75 years of indoctrination by TV and the major media, not to mention the United States federal government. I'm trying to say this fast to get through, and I'm stumbling on my words. So the first thing to understand is that this legal argument is central to why Kim Davis, as an example, was not an oath, was an oath keeper and was not a lawbreaker. And before you leave here today, I'm hoping you're going to understand this legal argument and be fully able to articulate it persuasively. So stay with me. But first, I got to tell you something. Here's, again, because I'm worried about time, and you know how the pastor is. He's going to cut me off. So I'm going to give you the end of my speech right now, just so I make sure I get it in, okay? And then I'm going to come back and give you the middle of my speech, all right? All right, I am an amateur musician, and you could put a capital A on the amateur part, okay? So, but when I came back from this Kim Davis rally, I was inspired to do what I sometimes do, and God gave me a song, and I wrote the song, and I'd like to, there's a little introduction that I'd like to play for you, and play for you the song. Anybody remember Buddy Holly? Buddy Holly and the Crickets, right? Okay, well, this is more or less in that style. My daughter, who is a professional musician, warned me. She said, Dad, you know, the style that you're used to might not be the style that everybody else likes and loves. And I went, nonsense. Of course they do. Of course they do. So anyway, there's a little introduction here that talks about how we're brainwashed. And the purpose of this song is to unbrainwash you, okay? So it's called Courts Cannot Make Law. And I want you to go out, my hope is that you'll go out of here going, courts cannot make law, and you'll be singing it. All right, so here we go.
I'm sorry to say, I'm afraid you and I have been brainwashed. The dictionary defines brainwashing as making someone adopt radically different beliefs by using systematic pressure. One form of pressure is repetition. Here's an example of what I mean. You know that the United States Constitution provides for a separation of church and state, thus prohibiting Bible instruction and prayer in public schools. And you know that appellate courts make law by means of opinions and orders handed down by judges. Well, the fact of the matter is that none of this is true. The phrase separation of church and state is nowhere to be found in the Constitution, and all legislative authority is vested in the legislative branch, leaving no authority for judges to make law. So, now, I've told you, and you know the truth. But even though you know it, you still don't believe it. Why? Repetition. You've heard it over and over and over from media, government, and academia. You've heard it so many times that you are brainwashed. So I am here to help. I've written a little song and put together a music video called Courts Cannot Make Law. And all you have to do to get unbrainwashed is to listen to it over and over and over again and sing along until you are completely unbrainwashed. You're welcome. I hope you enjoy the video.
There's a battle going on, a war for your soul. It's a devil's deal, it's mind control. They want you to believe that you have no hope. They're counting on the fact that you are a dope. Well, they tell you the rules, tell you what to eat. They know that you won't question, they know that you don't read. We've lived a lie for way too long. It's time to know right from wrong. No matter what they told you all, courts and judges cannot make law. The case law method has a
catchy, huh?
flaw because courts cannot make law. Courts cannot make law. Courts cannot make law. The case law method has a fatal flaw because courts cannot make law. Congress makes the laws and the courts make none. That's in the Constitution, it's in Article 1. Look it up, read the words, use your own two eyes. Know it well, mark the spot, have it memorized. Tell your children, tell your mama, tell your family. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors if you wanna be free. You won't learn the truth in government schools. It's up to you to know the rules. No matter what they told you all, courts and judges cannot make law. The case law method has a fatal flaw because courts cannot make law. Courts cannot make law. Courts cannot make law. The case law method has a fatal flaw because courts cannot make law. Oh, Dred Scott was not law, you see. They ignored the court then, and so should we. Slaughterhouse and Mickey Mouse and Roe v. Wade. Opinions are not how law is made. That's not the way that our founders planned. Now wise up and rise up across the land. Spread the word so everybody knows this emperor has got no clothes. No matter what they told you all, courts and judges cannot make law. The case law method has a fatal flaw because courts cannot make law. Courts cannot make law. Courts cannot make law. The case law method has a fatal flaw because courts cannot make law.
Okay. Thank you. You're very kind. I'm going to tell my daughter that you enjoyed it. You know, the dark side, the God haters, use the media and all different media in many ways to make their message the message. I believe that we need to use every outlet we possibly can to tell the truth, including me. At the homeschool convention, there was a group of homeschool. It was an ensemble that they put together, and it was wonderful just to see those children. We need to use all mediums that we have to tell the truth, right? Anyway, thank you for clapping for that. I appreciate it. By the way, the CD of that is out on the table out there. All right, so look, we're running up against the clock here, so let's do the legal argument that I promised you, okay? All right. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution, the very first sentence of the Constitution. Now, I'm not talking about the preamble, we the people. I'm talking about the very next sentence, the first sentence, begins with the word, it says, all, and let's just pause right there. What does all mean? We're clear on that? I had a teacher that used to say, all means all, and that's all means, right? Okay, so the rest of it says, all legislative powers, that's the power to make law, herein granted, this by the Constitution, shall be vested, can't be divested, it's got to stay there, in the Congress of the United States. Got that? All legislative powers, all lawmaking ability, power, herein granted, shall be vested in the Congress of the United States. All right. If that's the case, then if all lawmaking power is in Congress, how much is left over for the courts? That's a math problem. It's pretty easy, right? Zero, nada, zip, right? By the way, parenthetically, if all lawmaking power is in Congress, how much is left over for executive orders to be law? Now, I'm not saying there is not such a thing as executive order, and I'm not saying there's not such a thing as a court opinion. I'm saying neither of them can possibly be law, and I just showed you why, right? Under the Constitution, I just showed you why. So now you know what I'm going to call the temporal or the horizontal argument, the earthly argument, subject to man's laws, the Constitution. Now you know why courts cannot make law. You got it? Yes. There's more. There's an eternal argument. There's a vertical argument as well, why courts cannot make law. All right. And we don't have much time, so let's hurry. So here is the Declaration of Independence, color-coded, if you will. The reason I put it this way is those blue pages represent about 3/4 of the document, and about 3/4 of the document is nothing but a list of complaints and grievances against the king and indirectly against Parliament. Right? That's what the Declaration is mostly. It's 27 complaints. Now, I'm going to suggest to you and ask you, if that's all it was, if it was just a list of complaints and that's all it was, it would probably be lost to history. You and I wouldn't know it. We wouldn't have any part of it memorized. And we wouldn't be talking about it right now. But that's not what happened. Well, if you have 27 grievances against the king, but the king is the ultimate lawgiver, no appeal. Whatever comes out of the mouth of the king is the law. Then what does it matter if you have 27 grievances, or 127, or 8,627? What does it matter if you're up against the ultimate lawgiver and there's no appeal? You can have all the grievances you want. Our founders, recognizing that, on that gold page or that yellow page, made a legal argument. And that legal argument was based on the fact that there's a lawgiver above the king, that the king owes a duty to and the king owes a fealty to. And eventually the conclusion in the Declaration is that the king, because he didn't obey that, is not fit to be the ruler of a free people. Right? So let's examine that legal argument for a second. Sometime when you were young, probably because somebody thought it was important, that you should memorize the Declaration of Independence. So the Declaration of Independence begins when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for a people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate equal station, the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind, require them to set forth the reasons which impel them to that separation. And then it goes on, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men have evolved equal, right? Just trying to see if you're there. Did they say all men have evolved equal? Said all men are created equal, which is a very different thing to say with very different consequences, right? So what do you have to presuppose to say that all men are created equal? What do you have to already believe? That there's a creator God, and that there was a creation, I would say, right? You have to already believe that. So they already believe that. And not only did they believe that, they said that we hold these truths to be self-evident. We're not even going to subject them to argumentation. We're just going to declare them because they're self-evident. So they said there is a God. Then they went on, they said they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, our rights come from God. They're part of His created order. They don't come from government. He went on to say, Jefferson went on to say, something very profound. And I want to ask you, when somebody walks up your driveway, knocks on your door, wants your vote, your money, your support in some way, I think a very fair question that you can ask them is, what is the purpose of government? What's the purpose of government? Just ask them that question, and then do your best to shut up. And let them answer, and see what they say. And I've done this, by the way. I've done this personally. A gentleman walked up, he was running for a state position in my town, in my county, and he walked to my driveway and I asked him that question. And he started talking about baseball fields. I don't know. He started talking about recs and parks. But if you listen to people, you'll find out whether they share this American view of law and government or they don't. You will find out whether they're qualified to hold office or not if you ask them that question, then be quiet. Right? So, but what did Jefferson say? Jefferson said the purpose of civil government, he said, to secure these rights. What rights? The rights you just talked about in the sentence before. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. So the purpose of government is to secure God-given rights. It's not to make sure your seatbelt is buckled or that you're wearing your helmet. And it's also not to take money from you because you clearly have it and give it to her because she clearly needs it, right? Excuse me, pardon me for pointing at you. But it's not to redistribute wealth. That's not the purpose of civil government. The purpose of civil government is to secure God-given rights. So here it is. Please say it after me. There is a God. Our rights come from him. The purpose of civil government is to protect God-given rights. It's just that simple. That's the American view of law and government. It also happens to be the biblical view of law and government. And this is what we've been teaching about for 20 years. It's not just a fancy philosophical principle. It's the law. I'm going to let that sink in for a second. What we just described, there is a God, our rights come from him, the purpose of civil government is to protect God-given rights, is the law. Why? Well, the U.S. Code says the Declaration of Independence is the organic law of the United States. And if you let that sink in a minute, you'll think, well, you'll realize that if something is not in harmony with that, then it can't be law. Right? Right. But I'm pausing again, not because I'm trying to be funny, but it's because it's a big thought. We live in an age where that's a big thought. So the recognition of God's authority as the underpinning of law and government in America is the law. So things that aren't authorized by the Constitution, for example, let me just use the example of Obamacare or Roe v. Wade. You hear people all the time say, well, that's the law of the land. Well, no, it's not. We shouldn't use that term if we know that that's not true. As a matter of fact, our founders in that document, the Declaration of Independence, they called things that they knew were not law and not authorized, they called them pretended legislation. Please say that word with me. Pretended legislation. I think that's a marvelous term. Here it is in the Declaration. He has combined with others, he meaning King George III, has combined with others, meaning Parliament, to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. They didn't call these things that they knew were not law, and we shouldn't either. Right action, I had a pastor once tell me, right action follows right thinking. We need to think about these things rightly. We should not be calling things that are not law, law. So how do we recognize, though? Here's the question. How do we recognize pretended legislation when we see it? Well, there is a way. If we go back to Sir William Blackstone, who was very influential on our founders, he was kind of a half a generation ahead of our founders, and actually Jefferson was quoting Blackstone when he used the term law of nature, nature's God, in the Declaration. Blackstone put together something called Commentaries on the Laws of England, and in that he said this: man, considered as a creature, must necessarily be subject to the laws of his creator, for he is an entirely dependent being. It is necessary that he should in all points conform to his maker's will. This will of the maker is called the law of nature. So the law of nature that Jefferson was referring to is the will of God. All right? This law of, and here he goes on to say that this law of nature dictated by God himself is superior in obligation. Please let this sink in. This law of nature dictated by God himself is superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe, in all countries, and at all times, and no human laws are of any validity if contrary to this. right? Well, Exodus 20:13 as an example says, thou shalt not murder. So anything that allows that can't be law. All right. So Blackstone gave us 3 categories of law. The first 2 combined together to form what he called the divine law. The first is the law of nature revealed by God through human reason. This is what Paul called the law written on your hearts, right? All right. And you're without excuse for knowing it. Then he talked about the revealed law, which is found only in Scripture. So this is basically general and special revelation, right, that he's talking about here. And then the third category, somehow the third category slide is missing. The third category is what Blackstone called municipal law. Okay, so you've got the first 2 categories comprised of divine law. And the third, municipal law, is all the laws that we as men make. All our constitutions, all our statutes, all our regulations. That's all what he called municipal law. And Blackstone's point was, if municipal law, the stuff we do, is not in harmony with the divine law, then it ain't law. Let me let that sink in, please, for a second. Anything that man does that's out of harmony with what God says is not law and can't be law. And this philosophy that I'm describing to you is the law in America. But we've been brainwashed out of understanding it, haven't we? Okay, so test A, the eternal standard, is the eternal standard for God's word, right? Test A is the divine, and test B is the temporal. And hold here in my hand a Bible and a pamphlet that contains the Constitution. But let me just ask you, if Neil and I were having an argument about how long this podium is, right? And he said this was 30 inches long, and I said it's no more than 27 inches long. By the way, he's a guy that knows measurements. He has a machine shop. He knows all about that. So he's probably going to be right. But let's say we have a disagreement about that. And we ask the pastor here to come up and settle the matter for us. He's going to judge the matter for us of how long this is. What does the pastor have to bring with him? Right. He needs some form of a fixed standard by which to judge the matter. So just like that, we need a fixed standard to know what's law and what's not law, don't we? Okay, so here's the image that I want you to take away. Here's the ruler that indicates a standard. Law has to meet both of these standards. It has to meet the biblical standard and the Constitution. And it's what I'm calling the eternal standard and the temporal standard, or the horizontal standard and the vertical standard. You with me? It's got to meet both to be law, both. Okay? So if we want to determine if something is or is not law, we must apply the standards. Well, let's just talk about Roe v. Wade for a second. Roe v. Wade. Let's use the horizontal standard, the temporal standard first, okay? What I'm calling test B. What is Roe v. Wade? Where did it come from? What is it? Oh, good answer. No, it's a court opinion, right? So what branch of government is that from? Is that the branch that makes law? Then how can Roe v. Wade be law? It can't. So it fails that standard, right? So what would our founders have called Roe v. Wade? Pretended legislation. And actually, it's not even that, right? Because it's not even legislation. It's just, what does it say at the top of the page? It says opinion. It's an opinion. Okay, in Norton v. Shelby County, and I quote this Supreme Court case from way back in 1886, not because the Supreme Court is always right, but they were here, in my view. And they said this: an unconstitutional act is not law. It confers no rights, it imposes no duties, affords no protection, creates no office. It is in legal contemplation as though it had never been passed. Okay, so unconstitutional things are a nullity. So let's talk about test A with Roe v. Wade, the eternal test. What does the Bible say about the taking of innocent life? You can't, right? Exodus 20:13 says, thou shalt not murder. So Roe v. Wade fails both tests, doesn't it? Fails the eternal and the temporal test. So let me ask you this. What if Congress actually passed a law allowing abortion? And what if the president signed it? And what if the courts gave some validity to it? Would abortion be legal then? Thank you. Of course not. Of course not. Because it still doesn't meet the standards. It doesn't matter what they say. No matter what they told you all. Courts and judges cannot make law. In order to be valid, an enactment must pass both tests. It must meet both standards, right? Now, if we want to determine if something is or is not law, we must apply the standards. But to apply the standards, what? You've got to know the standards, right? You have to know this standard And you have to know this standard, right? You have to know them. You can't apply them if you don't know them. I used the example earlier. If somebody's running for office, you can ask them that question. Here's another question you can ask them. Just ask him to tell you what the Third Amendment is about, or the Eighth Amendment is about. Or ask him to tell you what the 5 freedoms are that are protected by the First Amendment. If they want to represent you and defend your rights, they ought to know what your rights are, shouldn't they? That's a fair thing to ask, isn't it? But you can't ask that question unless what? Well, unless what? You got to know the answer before you can ask the question, right? So see, the job of an elected official is to obey his oath of office, and our job is to hold that elected official to his oath of office. He can't do his job unless he knows the standards. We can't do our job unless we know the standards, right? We have to know the law. So my point here is the more we study the Bible and the Constitution, the more equipped we are to guard our liberty and to pass on the blessings of liberty to posterity. And I've said this, I don't believe you can conquer Christian people. Because the Christian people will see it coming. Because they know what law is and what law isn't. So in order to conquer Christian people, what do you have to do? You have to de-Christianize them, don't you? And then in effect, you will have conquered them, or they will actually have conquered themselves. Right? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee. I will also forget thy children. Back to John Adams. This Constitution was intended for a moral and religious people. We've got to be a moral and religious people. And a moral and religious people have studied and know the standards. And they hold the elected officials. They can hold their civil government accountable because they know the law. But you can't do that unless you know the law. I just spent this time at this homeschool convention, and as I mentioned earlier, knowing what the law is and knowing the rules and knowing that the culture war exists is what we need to pass on to the next generation. I'm actually delighted, and I want to express my thanks to Jake MacAulay, who told me to come here, who ordered me to come here, because he is the next generation he's like the Johnny Appleseed of this now currently, and coming along right behind him are his sons Dominic and Joshua, and they are so I really want to lend my back and my shoulder to the homeschool wheel, because I believe, as I say, I think it's the brightest hope shining in America, because our children need to know what we have actually been brainwashed out of understanding, and we need to know it too. This is my introduction to a crass commercial that on our table outside are our materials designed to do exactly this, to train you up and help you understand these standards so that you can be an effective citizen and make the application of your worldview, your biblical worldview, to civil law and government. We've been sold this lie of separation of church and state, which has made us compartmentalize those things. And we do a presentation. I have time to go into it now, but the great lie of separation of church and state is such a good lie. That's in air quotes. Such a good lie because why? Because it's partly true. There is a separation of function between church and state, but neither church and state are separated from their Creator, who has ordained their jurisdiction. Right? So there's a separation of church and state, but not of God and state. Right? Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.